Right, welcome to the session for game-based learning, serious games, gamification, or whatever you want to call it in the next few years. It might be called something else. The fact that the use of games has been have received a lot of interest this past few years from different various sectors and industries, and especially in learning. Everyone is trying to use games because games are exciting. Games is something that everyone would think would help you to engage your learners. But I think we need to start from scratch. I think we need to be more holistic in the way we look at games. There are different games out there. For example, remission, that's been proven in some ways in very bespoke scenario where it sort of enhanced adherence to the use of cancer treatment. There are a lot of different games out there which has been used, for example, Prepare, which has been used in within the classroom setting to help teachers to teach or to talk about sensitive issues, for example, sexual pressure and coercion, and the studies have shown that it is effective. But the issues that we have is that it's difficult to replicate what is effective in one game and try and apply it in another domain. And then you have to start from scratch, and you have to create new games reusing possibly similar mechanics, but you can't guarantee whether it's going to work or not. But one thing that is clear from our experience at the lab itself for the past 1.5 years, as well as based on our experience, and I see a few colleagues who were at the Serious Games Institute before, we found that we need to really start with the challenge and start with the topic and the subject that we want to address, and work with the people who are actually going to use these particular techniques in their teaching and learning. And because most of the time people are very much technologically driven, and instead of focusing on the users and focusing on the subject experts, they would focus on how wonderful games are, and the 3D environment, the sort of the role play sort of scenarios that you can create by using games. And at first, it's like, as game designers, myself and Sam, who is here as well, who we used to be game designers at the Serious Games Institute before, we were very much driven by how wonderful 3D environments are. We just want to use it. We look at different games out there. Can we just use this and then use it to teach someone else? And we did it wrong. So from there, from the experience that we have from the different projects that we're working on, either projects that are working with staff across the university, the projects that are working with partners from Europe as well as the US through funded projects, we learned that it is important to actually work with the stakeholders. And the stakeholders at the university are yourselves, who would know the different needs that you have, and we can work with you in trying to discover the different techniques that might work, that might not work. The only way for us to know is to try them out. And in order for us to try them out, we can promote a more sort of co-designing and co-curation and co-creation sort of approach, which we are pushing within the lab strategy, as well as what we're doing with our external partners. And we have one of my colleagues here, Luca. Morini has got a lot of experience in terms of the culture of games, and you have worked with schools and students as well, and he's got a lot of different perspectives on what games are and what gamification is. And
well, what happened today is that the session has been disrupted itself. Yeah. So we were supposed to have a more structured debate, and I was tasked to be the one who went to the deep end of criticism toward the use of games in education. So I will try to balance it out with the help of Sylvester, because I work with games with purpose every day. I do that with Sylvester, and I'm happy to do that. But there's some paradox in that. This expression, the bulwark of uselessness, is something that I heard in a game studies conference when Canadian scholar Bart Simon said that studying games and playing games is one of the only places that is safe from the relation of production and utility. So it's a place that must be preserved to be useless in a way. So it's not only about games, but it's about why we need games because they are powerful and they are useful, but we also need a culture of play. And what I mean exactly by this, I'm Italian, as you can hear, and on the Mediterranean side, we usually answer questions by asking bigger questions. So the question is why games? So the bigger question is why education? And if we answer this question, we can take different perspectives on what is the role, if any, of games and play in education. I tend to refer to this kind of tradition. It's a big quotation, but so there is education for conformity, for getting integrated in the present system and working with that, which of course needs to be done. We need to keep stuff working to survive in day-to-day, but there's also the creative side of education, so to critically and creatively engage. And there's this dichotomy of leisure and of uselessness and of fantasy and of possibility and of work and needs and reality. And I think that in current education and in all current society is a bit upside down. Again, our Mediterranean, leisure comes first. So we work a lot because then we can have leisure. Leisure is not loafing around, it's not just sleeping. Of course, there are problematic issues with this statement because he had a lot of slaves that labored for him. So there's that. But with our technology, we don't need actual slaves. From a Keynesian economic standpoint, we should be working less and less. That is mysteriously not happening because there's a push to labor and produce more and more because labor has come first. Leisure, of course, first. Leisure in Greek, kula, correct me, is something akin to skole, which of course is the root of school. So leisure for Aristotle was to engage in intellectual discussion. So maybe that is education. So there was this dichotomy, and there still is this dichotomy of work vs play, which is quite complex to articulate. And this is reflected in this way by the Protestant ethics. Scrooge is the emblem of the Protestant ethics. I don't have time for these movies and silly pleasures. I have the real pleasure, which is accumulating capital. And Roger Caillois, this might look like a critical thing, but he was actually acknowledging the value. The value of play isn't just wasting time. Oh, finally, we are having a space to waste. We are not just keeping together, we are wasting. And so, again, in this dichotomy, there is training, so that oriented to working and labor and production, there is training, but education is something else. So in this dichotomy, training is for performance, to product things, and we need to product things because we will die in a couple of weeks if we don't. But we also need to understand. So education is for understanding, and I do not mean understanding in a passive sense. I not mean reality is out there and we understand. No, it's build your own understanding. So now that I've done my Mediterranean philosophical derailing, let's get back to work vs play, which through the use of games in education, it risks becoming something like this. So we have this clash, which is completely new, because as we start using games to produce, as we start using games to work and to do useful things, it starts clashing with play, because we are forced to play those games, and the verb is not even good anymore. So let's focus on play. Let's focus on play. Play is voluntary, so they can't tell you play. It's something that you choose for yourself. Play can be anything you choose to do. And play, of course, the English language helps me. In Italian, we only have giocare, which goes for everything from gambling to playing to games, for everything. And that creates a lot of cultural problem, I will tell you. But play in English is something else. Play refers to this kind of activities. This is Dungeons and Dragons, which I love. And all these activities are something that is structured, is very structured. So they have their rules. Play needs rules. Play needs structure. But it works, it exists only when you push a bit against those structures. There's no meaning in play if it isn't against the very structure that sustains it. So the problem with games vs play is this one, especially in education. Of course, we need compliance. We need compliance in workplaces, because else everything will burn out and everyone will die in a couple of weeks. We need compliance in hospitals. Everything we can do to push a teenager to take his medicines for heart transplant, anything goes, of course. And we need to monitor that they actually do that. We need that. We need this. But it's not enough. Because if we only have this, well, you see the slippery slope. If we only have compliance and surveillance, there's nothing new, and the situation can get quite a bit dire and totalitarian. So this is a game for teaching, I think, fire escape compliant practices at Tesco. But this is a Minecraft stage. So someone wasted a lot of time, lots and lots of time, probably not by himself, probably it was a small group of people, and did this. This is beautiful. This is Minecraft.
Yeah. It's very with a 13-year-old boy.
Yes. And you know what is interesting? When you go and look up Minecraft for education, what are the differences in the programs? That you can keep kids on task. It's explicit on the web. To keep kids on task, to monitor them, and to make them compliant. And they will never do something like this if you keep them on task. So we need sometimes to keep them on task, I know. But there must be something else that goes beyond that. And then there's this other thing. There's outcomes vs community. So this is the Monopoly guy. Did you know the game of Monopoly was born as the landlord's game, which was a game made to critique the accumulation of lands. So if you have too many, Monopoly is a slippery slope. Once you are in advance of the others, once the others are behind, it's very, very hard to catch up. So the game, which is boring, as I play games of any kind every day from forever. As a gamer, Monopoly is a bad game because of this. And it was supposed to be a critique. It's satire, it's parody, and everyone plays it. And because we don't have a culture of play. We don't have a culture that really allows us to read this kind of systems. And what happens with this kind of culture of play that is focused on games and rules? It happens that we focus on winning, on the outcomes. But games and all the rule systems have some kind of, leeways. You can cheat. You can cheat. You can cheat at tests. Tests are games. They are scored. And everyone cheats at them. I cheated at them. So I know that's... I'm Italian. So it's a different thing. There's a whole anthropology of education book about cheating practices in Italian schools. That's extremely fun. And it's a way to build a community, because to enact some of those cheating practices, you have to be together. And it's more important than winning. It's more important than the learning outcomes as they are measured, because you can game the system in lots of ways. You can cheat. You can go and look for the professor's favorite things. You have a lot of ways to game the system. So to exploit its rigid structure to your advantage. But play is something else. Play doesn't focus on who is winning. I lose a lot. I play lots of board games. I lose a lot. That's not a problem. I'm still interested in that. I'm not a sore loser. And sore losers are a consequence of this emphasis on winning and game systems on the expense of play. So let's go on. And now it gets even more political. Games are just these fixed rules systems, and compliance and surveillance and winning. It makes you think that it can only go like that. But well, play is what you do with that kind of system that goes beyond. This is, well, Utopia by Thomas More. And games are other spaces. So when you actually play, not because you are being assessed for that game, but because you do it. You do it for play's own sake. You can experience a different space, a different place. You know that there is an alternative to what is considered reality. And well, Ernst Bloch spoke of the utopian potential of all art. And making games is an art. We are pushing more and more toward game design, to engage students in game design, not just in playing, but in make their own games. So they can create their own utopia, and they can read the games that are played on them. And I want to end with this thing, which is a typical thing of us in the lab. This is a cow that we throw each other. We have these meetings, these meetings with a very strict time schedule, so 3 minutes each. And if we go over, we get thrown the cow. We get hit by the cow. So this is a kind of feedback system. You've gone beyond. Here's the cow. But this is a game. This is a kind of a game. But what happens when play enters this kind of system? I've seen a couple of times people say, no, I'm talking beyond the limit because I want to play with the cow. So play in education is expressive appropriation. You have the rules, and you do something unexpected with them. The problem with the use of most games in education is that we expect the same results. Of course, we do a lot of market research or stakeholders research, and we focus them on a precise kind of stakeholders. And then we expect that they do the same thing. But if it's a good game, if they actually play with that, they won't. So this is it, and thank you for hearing my playful rant. And I think we can open the discussion a bit.
So this picture sort of is what our ethos is in terms of, I hate the word ethos, but I'm going to use it. Ethos in terms of the use of games in learning. It's not about creating a product. It's not about using the tool as the key instrument for us to help teaching and learning, but it's about the change of mindset. It's about introducing play in every single thing that we do. And my tagline on, I always say gamification is a way of life. That's how I practice it. That's how I motivate myself to do different things, especially on Monday morning when work is a bit dreary and the weather is a bit bad. So I try to give myself something to achieve that will make me feel good and give myself constant feedback on how good I am. But that's just me. So if you look at the first paragraph, where basically this is referring to Lego sets. We give someone a tool to use to learn, expecting them to use it, really. And in doing so, we are getting rid of the autonomy. We are getting rid of creativity. Even though the aim is actually good. We want to introduce creativity by using tools to learn. But I believe we need to work with the learners themselves, and us as educators, we need to understand that the power of play is fantastic in engaging learners in topics which are not interesting. The only challenge is to find the right approach and method. But the only way for us to do it is to be co-designers of the experience. Hence, at the lab itself, we introduce Game Changers, which is trying to help learners and lecturers to understand how can we look at play and then break it down to smaller chunks and try to understand what is the science behind it. How can we reach students who are not engaged in our classrooms? Because most of the time, if we introduce new technology, those who are already engaging with learning in our classroom, those are the people who will be, great users and adopters. But those who are not really engaging with what we're trying to do within a classroom setting, they would possibly, won't engage with new technologies or new tools at all. So it is a difficult thing to do. It is a great challenge. But what we have learned so far from the experience is that working with those who are at the front line, those who are actually doing the work in terms of teaching and learning, they understand where the students are coming from, and it helps us to understand the different techniques that can help them in their teaching and learning. And we have used card games, we have used board games, we have used role-playing, we have used gamification techniques, because we think that we want to go back to non-digital technologies to understand how to use the digital, if you know what I mean. So we need to understand how play works before we create something that will cost us like 100,000, 20,000 pounds to build. So using this as our cue, I'm opening the floor to everyone to sort of, tell us what you think about the use of games, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and so that we can learn from each other.
I just wanted to say, Sylvester, that we've talked a lot about young people, but actually there's a lot of evidence about older people getting a lot of benefit out of games. There's a brilliant example of a game in a hospital in Japan where they got a lot of older people using the Wii to do exercises.
Yep.
And one of the extra benefits was that some of the people that had dementia actually came in and joined in the games where they didn't actually join in any of the socialising. So there's a lot of other benefits as well, and for all age ranges.
Yeah.
I think that there's still, that's why I spoke about a culture of play. There's still a lot of stigma for grown-ups to play. Of course it's changing, and it's mostly socially acceptable to play some PlayStation games here and there, maybe. But if you go to role-playing games or board games, and the stigma comes up again. And it's not been hard. I'm speaking from a very personal standpoint. It's not been easy. I'm speaking from a very personal standpoint. So to be this kind of person and to hear, but you're still playing at your age? Yes. I will never stop. try to make me stop.
Yeah, just in terms of thinking about the use of gaming, not necessarily from an academic perspective, but sort of my background, I work in psychiatry, so I would work a lot in acute inpatient psychiatric wards. And I'm thinking about the engagement thing, like the lady just said there. A lot of the time, we would play things like table tennis, and we would do things like that with the patients. That to the outside eye, and it has been levelled a number of times, you're just skiving, you're just going off and doing and messing about and playing table tennis again. But then by the end of that day, we've done actually what our core business is. We've engaged the individual, we've managed to speak to them on a level that isn't one that has an imbalance of power. So in that conversation that you have just in the middle of a game of table tennis or whatever it is that we're doing, we've actually been able to really get that relationship and understand what's going on in that person's life and in that person's world in a way that's not threatening, in a way that facilitates growth and development.
I'm actually I'm a clinical psychologist before switching to education. So yeah, I could tell lots of stories of working with people with psychiatric problem of any age that can just find a new common language. Because games are feedback systems are quite simple usually, and it's a closed space, it's a safe space. So anyone can engage somehow. And if they go beyond the rules, if they actually play it, well, that's even better.
I was just going to.
No, it's recording.
Oh, okay. I didn't realise that. I was just going to say that I was thinking about the culture, if you like, of games, and I was thinking, well, particularly I think of my parents and my generation, I suppose, as well, to a point. But it's that whole puritanical ethic, which goes back to the 19th century and the sort of Victorians, and it's a work ethic. It's about, and so essentially, what are you doing? You're probably so there'll be certain games that will be acceptable at certain times. The sort of whole idea of sport on the field, etc., which part of that again Victorian. And I think that is still there. I think it's very much part of our culture actually. And I personally have a duality, shall we say. So games, and if you think about board games or something like that as an example, there's something that happened Christmas time. There are specific times where you can actually demarcate and say, this is a time to play this game, and we can actually relax and do that. Because otherwise, there'll be certain things that you do, and you might assign a certain time to now acknowledge that your body needs fitness. That's a new part of, I think, again, our culture. It's only really been happening in the last sort of 20 years, I suppose. And so I think that there is an acknowledgement now that games can be beneficial, but I still think there is this very strong work ethic in there.
If games are recognized as worthy, only if they are beneficial, it still falls under the same Protestant work ethics framework. So if games are good because they make me socialize, if the games are good because they make me unwind for work, if games are good because they make me more fit, that's not giving value to games in themselves as the end. When I put up Aristotle's quote, it was just that leisure is the actual end, not, of course, just laziness. It's completely different. But giving value to playful activity in itself, because it's purposeless, because it has no purpose. To give it value because it makes us more fit or intelligent or social, it's a slippery slope, because it leads the way of compliance and surveillance, which of course we need, but, well.
The quality of purposelessness is the quality essentially of art. That's the whole function of art, is to have no purpose but itself. So, in a sense, because I'm a musician, so you're talking about somebody who plays. So I acknowledge all that, but I play is essentially my job, it's my work. So there's a duality there, of course, because I play because I love, but I play because it's important. But anyway, yeah.
But it's true, it's like the word, but when you mention the word relax and work, so most people will not, get that experience, but if we can try and change that, it would be fantastic. Yeah.
There was a game designer, his name is Ian Bogost, I don't know if you've heard of him, and he created a game, the Click the Cow. And it was a crazy game because when you were talking, it made me think about it. The idea of it was you would click a cow on Facebook, and then you would come back and click the cow. And he did it as a satire game. It wasn't supposed to show how useless and meaningless this is. But then millions of people started playing it on a regular basis, and it was becoming an income source for them. And so how does the social idea, even of gaming and uselessness on the social web, always already become a commodity?
I think we need to uselessness and meaninglessness are two completely different things. Bogost aimed at making a meaningless game, but meaning is not something that is provided by the designer. The designer just provides the feedback system. And if people find some meaning in that, well, it's not a critique of those people. It's a witness to the power of play in appropriating. I tried to give you the most boring and useless and stupid game ever, and you still find a way to enjoy that. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's the same as Facebook now as well. On the Messenger, you can actually, if you send, pardon? It's like if you send sort of a basketball icon on your iMessenger or your Facebook Messenger to a friend, you can play basketball together. And then you would, and I tried it, and I spent probably about half an hour of my working time playing basketball just to compete, sort of thing. And I sort of learned about how do you tilt your phone, how do you look at, how do you, swoosh and whatnot. But anyway, that is another story. Yeah.
So I just think, I think one of the great things about games is that it breaks down the barriers. So especially when we talk about game-based learning or gamification, if we decided to play a game in this room, we might all come from different backgrounds, we might all have different job roles or whatever. But all of a sudden we are all on a sort of equal standing, and we know that there's a set of rules and we can just get together and play. And so when you talk about kind of game-based learning and gamification and that sort of idea, when you are the educator, sometimes one of the great things about games is that you can use these to sort of bridge that gap and then kind of open up the discussion for then kind of leading it into more of a, educational discussion or that sort of thing. So, sorry.
I've worked in both ordinary games and video games industries, and I'm now attached to Serious Games Institute, and I do agree with what Luca and Sylvester are saying, in that it reflects, in the last session, Brian Lamb was talking about educational technology, which was supposed to help learning, and it seemed a no-brainer that it does help learning. But as he pointed out, what it was doing was restricting learning as well. And I do think that's one of the problems about how games are treated, because the aim of games should be, as said, to facilitate play. But because it becomes a thing, then it actually starts restricting that. And I think that's why you have to have that kind of ethos, to repeat a bad word, which actually says there's a certain aim in mind, and what you do is construct environments that make that happen. But they might be ones which actually have to be, like Brian finished off, ones which actually have very, very little structure. Because the curious thing which has been found, isn't it, that's that picture, wonderful picture from Minecraft. Minecraft is a very curious thing because there is an element of gaming in there, but most people don't use it for anything like gaming. They just use it to make things from their imagination. And I think that's a lesson really in terms of how we use it for any purpose, whether it's learning or otherwise. And I think it's a real problem, but I think that is the problem we have to face. It's not about the fancy technology, and the fancy technologies can enable a lot of things, but can't be how you start. That can only be a part of the facilitation. And I do think it's a big, big challenge, a really exciting one, but that's the challenge really.
I think that this ties in, there's this designer / philosopher, Sebastian Detterding, who gives some advice on designing educational games, which is, do not design educational games. Design educational toys. So under-specify. Do not make them paths without definite end. Make them interesting objects for which to interact with the concept. So a toy is different from a game. And then there's also, this is almost advertisement, but I advise everyone to just look for his talk, Designing Against Productivity. There's a lot of talk of design for productivity, which is part of the Protestant push. Let's say, I don't want to be anti-religious, but it's an historical thing. But to think and design against productivity, it's just to give space also for learning, not for the purpose of learning, but there's space for a lot of stuff when we push a bit against productivity.
I just want to say thank you. It was a really, really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And it's just my comment sort of chimed with what was mentioned over there about this interesting thing for me, what the presentation raised for me in terms of boundaries and how it allows people to pass through boundaries. Because just thinking about my children, I've got a daughter who's 4. She's got very prescribed gender roles in her head at 4. Like if you have short hair and it gets fairly long, you've transitioned from being a boy to a girl in her head. But when she's playing, she goes from this kind of like view that she kind of like prefers reading about princesses and all of those kind of things to wanting to be the dragon or wanting to be the knight or wanting to be the fire person or something like that. And it completely changes, and then she goes back to normal life, and she's got her very prescribed roles again as well. It's amazing.
Experimentation space. And there was a lot of uproar recently about a game, it's called Rust, which just gives you a random avatar. It's a survival game. You just spawn in this post-apocalyptic wasteland, and you have, it's a violent game. You have to kill each other and try to build some kind of settlement to defend yourself. It's a rough simulation of that kind of space. But they started giving random avatars to the players. So you spawn, and suddenly you are a North African woman. And there was it's over? Oh, okay. And there was a big uproar from some people. No, I won't ever play this game again because I might spawn as something different from a Caucasian male. And that's interesting because the game was not. There are games like many role-playing games which are a lot about an identity. Like in role-playing games, in World of Warcraft or the like, I always play defensive roles. I feel that way. I feel that. But that game is not about identity. It's about smashing people's heads and trying to build a Stone Age settlement. So there's no identity rhetorics in the game, but still people said, I'm not playing anymore. Because this aesthetic thing goes completely opposite to what. So it's a safe place to experiment for identity, and it's also a place to disrupt this extremely rigid identity dynamic. So at least now we know that there are a lot of people who are disturbed by this. We knew it already, of course, but it's a new...
Right, everyone, I say we can continue the discussions as we go through the day. It's break time now. It's break time now. And after the break time, we've got a session here which is trying to use card games and visual cues to help you to be creative in telling a story, and that will help you to interpret abstract concepts as such.
And also, if you're not interested in this session, and in the class there, there'll be the flipped how session of how you can kind of manage a new workload, but without all the admin.
Thank you very much, everyone.